Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is the second of a special series in which Polaris Live invited 7 experts from the US, China, and the Middle East to offer their perspectives on the recently concluded 20th Communist Party Conference in Beijing. These programs are brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can ask questions throughout the program using the comment button on the right-hand side of the screen. Time permitting, we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. My guest on Polaris Live today is Professor Jonathan Fulton, who teaches international relations and political science at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, from where he comes to us today. In the United Arab Emirates, he is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. His research focuses on China relations with the Gulf Cooperation Councils, the Belt and Road Initiative, international relations of the Gulf, and Chinese foreign policy. Professor Fulton is also the series editor of Changing Dynamics in Asia, Middle East Relations, a series analyzing linkages between the two regions. He's a prolific author and editor of numerous authoritative books, and he's also the host of the very well-regarded China-MENA podcast series through the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. So with those few words, please welcome Professor Jonathan Fulton.
Thanks, Sarwar. Great to be with you again.
Good to have you on again, Jonathan. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to just get started right away with an overarching question for you. How would you rate the U.S.-Saudi Arabia relationship, especially, but also the U.S.-Middle Eastern relationship today? The narrative in America is that it is not very sound, that America and the Middle East are moving apart. America is starting to withdraw is the impression that's left. So how would you categorize it?
The thing I love about your show, Sarwar, is that you always start with the easy questions. The nice softball for me. I mean, the U.S.-Middle East relationship, I've lived in Abu Dhabi since 2006. I can't think of a single point over these past 16 years where I would say that was a period of relative tranquility in U.S.-Middle East relations. I think it looks particularly difficult right now because obviously the U.S. has recalibrated its foreign policy. It's looking at the Indo-Pacific as its priority theater. It's moved away from counterterrorism, which had it firmly planted in the Gulf and the rest of the Middle East. And that's just not been the case. I think a lot of the analysis we're seeing tends to reduce it to personality-driven politics. You know, it's President Biden and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and the two don't like each other, so the relationship is bad because of that. And I think that is a dramatic oversimplification. I think you have to look at the structural features of this asymmetrical relationship. First of all, it's always been an interest-based relationship rather than a values-based partnership. And for the U.S., the interests were largely, for the longest time, keeping the Soviets out of the Gulf, making sure that Gulf energy got to the global markets and kept the Western Bloc in a dominant position in the global economy. And when the Cold War ended, the U.S. stayed rooted in the Gulf. It had built up this formidable security architecture in the immediate post-Cold War era, and that was largely to contain Iraq and Iran. But at the same time, those main interests of keeping Gulf energy getting out to global markets and protecting Israel and making sure that the region, was safe for maritime security or navigation, they don't need the same kind of security presence that they've had to achieve those anymore. Israel has never been safer within its own region. A lot of Gulf energy consumers are in East Asia, which is more than capable of providing security or stability for that. The U.S. doesn't need the same kind of footprint in the Middle East that it's always had. And you put that on top of the fact that it hasn't necessarily been very good at its Middle East policy for quite a while. So I think what we see is, it makes sense for the U.S. to recalibrate, and it makes sense for the Middle East to reconsider its relationship with the U.S. as well. I think all of these bigger structural factors have been driving it a lot more than any kind of personal relationship between the two.
Let me ask you, based on what you just said, and I'm going to open this topic of, introduce the topic of the Ukraine war only because it relates to what you have just said, right? The impression here from the media is that how dare the Middle East, for whom we've given so much and had a long relationship, not support the Western position, the American position of unilateral support for Ukraine without giving any ground to Russia, right? And everyone is surprised at why that is happening. But there's Israel, which has also joined this crowd of not giving unilateral support. How does this all tie in? Does it mean that we've always taken this relationship very simplistically?
I think what's happening is that this is being viewed, it's natural. When you're in Washington and you're looking at the situation, you're going to look at it through the lens of your own interests. It's pretty hard to have that kind of strategic empathy to understand what is the other side, what's animating the other side's decisions. And especially for a lot of the Gulf energy producers, there was a long period, and I'm not making excuses. I'm just trying to kind of lay out maybe what I think would be some of the considerations. There's been a long period since 2014 when the oil market has not been very good. And a lot of countries that have budgets based on oil revenue took a big hit, for quite a while. And then COVID came and it made it even worse. And when you're a country like Saudi and your budget is based on $80 barrels of oil and you're not anywhere close to that, you're dipping into your strategic reserves or your sovereign wealth fund to fund a lot of federal projects. And that's a political problem. These countries' legitimacy is based not on elections, but on governance. And governance is hard to achieve when you're not getting any money. So I think these countries have had serious economic pressures, and OPEC Plus is something that they've been using for a few years now to try to coordinate their approach to the market. And in that, Russia's been an important actor. The UAE and Saudi and the other OPEC members and Russia have been cooperating a lot more closely in the past few years. And that's something that I think you shouldn't, we can't really dismiss. Now, of course, what Russia's doing is something that I think everybody is very disturbed by. I mean, I was at a conference over the weekend and some Kuwaiti speakers who were explaining why their government has the same approach to OPEC Plus, that they support what's happening. But at the same time, they said, hey, we remember what it was like to be invaded by a larger country and have our sovereignty compromised, and we hate it. And they couldn't have been more clear how much they are really against what Russia's doing in Ukraine. But at the same time, I think we have to understand that they are under different pressures, and they also have different views of this. I mean, if you ask most Arab people about Russia, they'd say, yeah, we saw this play out in Syria not long ago. And a lot of countries didn't really give it the same kind of weight that they're giving it when they do it in Ukraine. And we can all make assumptions of why that's the case. But, for them to say, look, when Russia did this to Syria, most people's concern was the refugee crisis that it created, not the fact that they were destroying cities and killing people and, all sorts of unspeakable things. And now when Russia's doing it to a European country, you expect us to feel, the same depth of rage as you feel. And I think that they're maybe surprised to find that that's not the case.
It's an interesting point you made, because we haven't seen as much in the newspapers as perhaps we should, that the same general who ran Syria for Russia is now running Ukraine for Putin. So I think you've made a really strong point there. But, this opens the door to this question, and I'm thinking now about Xi Jinping's upcoming visit although I know there's some question in the papers, at least this week, whether that is really going to go through or not. But let's assume it does go through. Do you think that this view is very simplistic, that because America and the West insists on liberal democracy, that relations with countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Middle East, and China become very difficult because of one of the things that you've just said, which just stuck with me, which is that their people judge them by their governance. And talking with a number of China professors, they've said, you have a more showmanship approach to picking your leaders. Our people don't even get to the top rung of the Politburo unless they've run a province in China. Most provinces are larger than countries in Europe. So before people can start ascending that, they have to show their governance. You've made the point that that's what people in the Middle East want to do, whereas in America and most of the West, but I'm talking about America on this program, it is more showmanship than governance, is what's pointed out. So do you think this is a basic issue that we have to accept the fact there will be different types of government, different types of governance, and not insist on one idea, i.e. liberal democracy for everyone in the world?
Well, I think, first of all, I've got to push back a little on the showmanship element, because any of us who've been watching the Party Congress in Beijing have been witnessing tremendous showmanship and pageantry, where every last second has been, scripted and everything's been planned for maximum effect. But I do take your point about the divide between governance and democracy, because that's something I talk about with my students a lot here in Abu Dhabi. When I teach a comparative politics class and we talk about democracy and different models of government, one thing they often stress is, there are ways to achieve good levels of governance that don't involve having elections. And then they point to, the UK and say, we watch what's happened since Brexit, and we don't want that. We don't like that kind of chaos. There are different approaches. Of course, we have to understand that. I think by the US talking about exporting democracy is one of the campaigns in the Gulf, especially with the invasion of Iraq. This is something that left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, not just here, but in China. A lot of authoritarian governments thought, hey, if one sovereign country is going to invade another sovereign country to try to change their model of government, that could happen to any of us. And that's something I think that really gets forgotten, is just the lessons that the rest of the world took from the U.S. invasion of Iraq, was that, it seemed really spectacularly misguided and hubristic. So I think, coming back to your question about China and the region, it's often portrayed this way, that, China's an authoritarian government, and much of the Middle East also has authoritarian governments. So there's this kind of natural synergy. That may be the case. I mean, when China offers lending for different infrastructure projects, when it offers contracts for different things in the region, when it's exporting technologies or UAVs or you name it, it doesn't have the same kind of conditionality that Western countries in general and the US in particular has. And I think that makes it easier for them to do these types of things, especially in the digital domains. But at the same time, I think it's not really, I'm not comfortable with this framing of democracy and authoritarianism. I think that a lot of people in the region like the idea that in democracies you have, more opportunities to voice your opinion or to be actively involved. I know that when the COVID outbreak started, a lot of people I talked to in the Gulf were very upset that, China's system was so closed that something like this was able to spread quickly, and the government was able to keep it under wraps.
Right.
And people found that very, very unappealing, to say the least. So I don't really think it's just a matter of, democracy is losing and authoritarians are winning. If we've seen anything from this war in Ukraine, it's the limits of a government that doesn't have multiple channels of information getting to the leaders.
But do you think in the Middle East, Jonathan, that America it could be the West, but again, I'm talking about America on this program, that America should not make that the centerpiece, that liberal democracy is what we are planning, and every country ought to head towards there because that's the kind of the nirvana of governments. Do you think that comes in the way of relations in the Middle East?
Well, I'm not certain that that's really the case. I mean, I should say, first and foremost, I'm not from the US, I'm from Canada, so I'm not trying to speak for America here. But when I do talk to a lot of American officials in the region, they're very, clear-eyed about the Middle East. They don't see this as a place that should, it's ripe for, regime transition into democracies. I think that they do feel things like human rights should be respected more, because when that happens, then you get better outcomes that people have with more property rights are able to start businesses more easily and have a better stake in their society. And there's a lot of good overspill from this. I don't think they feel that, the US is the Middle East is a place that they should switch. I think that's become a big part of the narrative, because when President Biden took office, or even before during the election campaign, he talked a lot about a values-based foreign policy. And I think, to me, that seemed to be in response to China more than anything. Now, again, as a Canadian, under the Trump administration, where values was not a part of the foreign policy at all, when two Canadians were detained in China and kept locked up for a very long time over very, very, very trumped up charges, there was nothing really Canada could do, because typically there would be a coalition led by the US that would have kind of leaned on China heavily. But at this point, the US was pursuing the trade war and trying to get concessions out of China for different things. At the same time, you had Australia that was getting hammered economically by China. You had a lot of European countries and the UK also being bullied, I guess, by China. And the US didn't really do much to kind of create this coalition. We were all kind of left to act independently. And, in any kind of relationship with China, it's very asymmetrical. So I think when President Biden took office and talked about a values-based approach, I think what he was saying was, let's get Western democracies together as a bloc again to try to balance against China. And I think in doing that, he probably forgot, oh, wow, we've got a lot of allies and partners who aren't democracies in the Middle East. And the way he was talking, I think, alienated a lot of them. And the Saudis especially, because, he promised to make the Crown Prince of Saudi a pariah. And he was very, very strong in his condemnation of the Saudis, which I think was a mistake, because Saudi and the US are very important partners. Again, beyond the personalities, structurally, they've done a lot of important stuff together, whether it's on intelligence sharing or security or working in the Middle East to promote each other's interests. So to treat such a close partner like that, really, in my view, wasn't the smartest move.
Well, that's very interesting. But let me ask you, as an aside, a lot of what he said when he ran for the presidency was in reaction to the the murder of Khashoggi, the journalist, American-based but Saudi journalist, right? Has that played an overarching role in the Middle East? Have people taken that to say, oh my God, how can we do something as horrific as this? And therefore Saudi Arabia needs to be sidelined a little bit. Has that played as much there as it is here?
It's probably easier to ask somebody from the region that. I mean, because all I can tell you is my perspective from watching, and it's not really definitive what I've seen. I think that people were very surprised, because if you look at the timeline, when the Crown Prince that year, I was in San Francisco for a conference, I guess in March of that year, so that was 2018, and just prior to that, he had conducted like this 6-week-long visit to the U.S., where he was visiting with celebrities and Bill Gates and government leaders, and he's being feted as this, kind of visionary new leader, the kind of leader that everybody's wanted Saudi Arabia to have for a very long time.
Correct.
Somebody's going to loosen the religious restrictions and open the economy and try to deal with corruption. I think so on the one hand, you've got this leader who's trying to do these types of things that a lot of people are very enthusiastic about in the region. For Saudi to go back to this pre-1979 approach to the Middle East, I think everybody found that quite attractive. But then the flip side of that was things like Jamal Khashoggi or all of these Saudi elites who were being locked up in the Ritz-Carlton. I think people found it troubling because there's this mix of things that they like and things that make them nervous or things that trouble them. And I don't think that just is a case for actors in the region. I think a lot of people, a lot of companies, there was the Davos in the desert held in Saudi shortly after that the story broke, and not many people went. Now, maybe they didn't go because of the PR implications. They didn't want to be seen to be doing deals at that time. But I think a lot of those people felt, let's wait and see what this government looks like. Like, is it the government that's all about economic and social reform, or is it the place that's locking up women who want to drive? So I think it's really hard to say. I don't know how much that's shaping American perceptions. I don't know how much is shaping Middle Eastern perceptions. I know that's certainly complicated things.
Yes, that's for sure. So you seem to be saying that this narrative that there is now more space between the American and the Middle Eastern countries, especially Saudi Arabia, and that Xi Jinping's forthcoming visit. And by the way, do tell us whether that you think is going to happen, whether that can find a way to pierce that space, to enlarge it for China's interests.
Well, first of all, I do think it will happen. There's been a lot of leaks that have been taking place since March of this year. There was a story in the Wall Street Journal that, Xi Jinping would be going to Saudi in March. They also said that Saudi is going to start selling oil to China in renminbi. Both those things turned out to not be the case. Then there was another story that happened while I was on vacation in Canada this summer that he was going to visit Saudi that week in August, which personally was very inopportune for me because I had to spend a lot of time talking to journalists instead of enjoying a peaceful week on the lake. But that also proved not to be true. I think what we know is that there's going to be a China Arab States summit, which I believe is going to happen in December. And I think that's probably what we'll see is that President Xi will visit Saudi and take care of this state visit and the summit probably at the same time. It's not been confirmed, but that's what I anticipate will happen. Now, as to whether the space between the U.S. and Middle Eastern countries creates opportunities for China, well, of course it does. But I think one thing we have to consider is that up until, the China and the Middle East is a story that's become very, very sexy recently. But it's something that's been obvious for quite a while. And not many people noticed because not many people were looking. But here in the Gulf, if you look at China GCC trade in 2000, the six Gulf Cooperation Council countries collectively did just under $10 billion worth of trade with China.
Right.
Last year, it was about 200 billion. They've been developing these relationships, primarily economic, in a big way for about a good 20 years. And especially since 2013, when the Belt and Road Initiative was rolled out, and you start to see a lot of Chinese SOEs playing a much bigger role because Middle Eastern countries are trying to create these post-oil economies. There's a lot of vision, Saudi Vision 2030, New Kuwait 2035, Oman Vision 2040. All these projects are ways to try to diversify their economies, and a lot of these projects line up really, really neatly with the Belt and Road cooperation priorities. So we've seen a lot of this happening. Now, the thing is, for China, I think something that made them feel very comfortable operating in the Middle East was the U.S. security commitments to the region. That they could have lots and lots and lots of Chinese citizens operating in the region, a lot of Chinese private and state-owned companies operating in the region, without having to, implement this corresponding security architecture to take care of it all. And that's not just China. Everybody's done this. India does it. Japan does it. Korea does it. The Europeans do it. So I think China was very satisfied to think, look, we can go into this region, this lucrative region where, China gets between 40 and 50% of its oil from the Gulf every year. And to think, look, we can operate there knowing that the US is going to, maintain this umbrella for us. Now, I think what's happened in the past few years, going back to the trade war in the Trump administration, I think when the US weaponized trade, China started to rethink this. Look, we do a lot of important business in the Gulf or in the Middle East. It's important to us. It's not a top tier foreign policy issue, but it's still pretty important. And if the U.S. is going to use it as a way to potentially, punish us, whether it's through trying to prevent us from getting, 5G networking contracts or threatening the stability of energy, then maybe China feels they got to push back a bit. So we've been seeing a bit of that in the past few years, with China's closer engagement with Iran, with offering to help Saudi with its nuclear energy program, with offering to help Saudi with its indigenous ballistic missile capacities. China's starting to push back in ways I think that the U.S. isn't very comfortable with. I don't think that this is immovable. I think China could if U.S. and China could coordinate on the region, you could see a situation where they could have a very constructive relationship here, because fundamentally they have very similar interests in the region, but they have very oppositional interests in other regions.
Well, which brings me, we have about 5 minutes left in the program, but my recent report for the Foreign Policy Association released last month argues that the politicians on all sides have worked themselves into a corner. And I was speaking there generally China and the US. And it's time to let business take the leading role and let the businessmen and women, financial people, take the initiative, because they seem to be moving ahead quite rapidly and quite profitably. And so do you think that that is an approach that should guide not just U.S.-China policy, but U.S. Middle Eastern policy for a while? Is let's just cool tempers. Let's just cool this business of governance and changes and so on, and let businessmen and women lead, and let's see what happens. What do you think?
Well, I'm a political scientist, right?
I did know that.
Well,
But
the
you
business
guys
college
deal with
is
a little bit like banking, right? The paycheck comes in every 2 weeks.
Well, the business colleges always get all the great grants and all the big salaries. So we political scientists don't like the business folks that much. I would argue, I'll play devil's advocate here. So a lot of the U.S.-China policy was shaped very substantially by America's commercial interests for a long time. This idea that U.S. companies, the Chamber of Commerce in Beijing and in Shanghai were very instrumental in shaping a lot of U.S. policy, because they'd say, look, don't push China on stuff that's politically sensitive. We're all doing great business here, and it's a great market, and China's going to change as we become more deeply integrated economically. And then when the business companies start to realize, like, hey, China state-owned enterprises are still getting a tremendous amount of money from the government, which undercuts our profit margins because we can't compete when they've got the resources of the state behind them. They started complaining to the government and saying, hey, look, we're being undermined by Chinese business. So they changed U.S. policy in a different direction, and I think that's where we got with the Trump years. So I think instead what I would say is, how about getting serious people who can take a long-term strategic overview without getting caught up in the day-to-day of markets and where the dollar is on things. Think of like when George Kennan was brought into government, and they said, look, think big thoughts and avoid trivia, and just get a bunch of people to say, we need a proper China policy that's not going to switch when Congress switches or when a new administration comes in, or when markets shift, and just what is our primary interest here? Like, how is it that we can manage this very, very, very important bilateral relationship in a way that advances our interests without curtailing their interests? Because we have to recognize China is a very important global actor now, and we have to understand that what they want matters, and we can't really simplify that.
Which takes me back to this, if you will, positioning, re-election, however you call it, of President Xi Jinping for the next 5 years. So in a sense, this should give a lot of countries in the Middle East and around the world a little more of a steady hand in crafting foreign policy, right? Because now they know he's going to be there for 5 more years. Is that another weakness, you think, in let's say, the American system, especially for countries that are more authoritarian, as in the Middle East, that we don't know what's going to happen the end of this year, much less 4 years from now when the president changes?
Well, I do think that here in the Gulf especially, a lot happens at personal levels. Your relationship with certain leaders really has the potential to lubricate relations and other things. And I think that, if you look at, as long as I've been in the UAE, I believe that Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed has been the foreign minister for almost the entire time I've been here.
Right.
In Saudi, they had the same foreign minister for 45 years. Having China, they've known that Wang Yi was the foreign minister from 2013. And, you develop a rapport. You understand how to work with somebody this way. Now, in Canada, again, where I'm from, I think we've had 11 foreign ministers in the past 14 years.
Wow.
Yeah, it's not the optimal way to run your foreign policy. So it's hard for, when you've just got this revolving door. And I think it's not really the same case in the US, but the fact that every 2 years your government gets changed when midterms happen and, things in the House change and everybody's got to recalibrate based on that. It does build in a lot of uncertainty into the bilateral for a lot of countries. And, like us in Canada, we're always watching the US because that shapes everything we're going to do in foreign policy. And I think a lot of countries in the Middle East, you look at where their top diplomats are, where their smartest foreign policy thinkers are, and a lot of them are going to be in DC.
Right. Well, listen, let's end on a positive note. If you find yourself alone with President Biden, one piece of advice for him concerning the Middle East and America and the foreign policy that is being crafted.
Well, I guess it would be the same point I made about the U.S.-China relationship. Is I think people in the Middle East want to know very clearly what to expect from the U.S. What does the U.S. want from the region? Nobody knows, frankly, at this point, because it seems to be switching from not even from one administration to the next, but in August when President Biden visited Israel and visited Saudi, and everybody said, look, things are back on track. And then 2 months later, OPEC Plus happens, and everybody in the Democratic Party is saying, enough of this, we can't work with these guys anymore. I think there has to be a recognition that the Middle East, for all of its troubles, is some pretty important real estate, not just for America, but a lot of America's allies and partners. And you need to have a strong presence and a strong policy here in order to support your allies and partners. Maybe you don't need energy the way you used to need it from the region, but knowing how it can affect markets is a big deal. Like everybody said, now that the U.S. is the top producer, it doesn't have to worry. Well, look what happens when the Saudis can move supply the way they can, and what that does to price and how that affects the U.S. consumers, how it affects people's oil bills. Obviously, this is very, very important. So I think what the U.S. needs is to have an honest assessment of what does it want out of the Middle East, talk with local actors to find out what the Middle East wants of the U.S., and then go from there.
So, Jonathan, we have about a half minute left at this point. Tell us in a few words about your podcast and where people can find it.
Oh, it's very good.
So I have no doubts.
No, so this podcast we started releasing it, I believe, in February or March this year. And what it is, it's called the China-MENA podcast. I'll put a link to it in the comment section on your YouTube page.
Thank you.
Oh, nice. There it is. But the idea is there's a lot of hyperbole. There's a lot of breathless headlines saying, the U.S. pulls out and China fills a vacuum and China and Iran are overthrowing the Middle East. And, what I do is I talk to folks either from China or from the Middle East, or people like me who are from neither but are really interested in the subject. And each show focuses on either a bilateral relationship or a topic. And we just try to get beyond the headlines to give a fuller picture of what's really happening there. So the first episode, I talked with the brilliant Anush Etashami, who's a prof at Durham University in the UK. He's an Iran specialist. And, we looked at the issue of this Iran-China comprehensive strategic partnership. What does that change? What does it not change? What does it mean for Iran? What does it mean for China? And I think at the end of 45 minutes, hopefully people would say, okay, look, I learned something and I'm not so scared anymore. And maybe, China and Iran working together isn't going to be this dramatic thing that we thought it was.
Okay. Well, a sister program to Polaris Live, or brother, depending
Excellent.
on how you look at it.
Sibling.
So, listen, Jonathan, Dr. Jonathan Fulton, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. I want to again thank you profusely for being with us to make some sense of the Middle East as it relates to America and the world.
Sure. Thanks, Sarwar. Thanks so much.
So I want to thank our viewers from around the world. Please join us again for the next episode in this special series of programs in which we explore China, the United States, and the Middle East, and offer their perspective on the recently concluded 20th Chinese Communist Party conference in Beijing, and what the conference results mean for the US, China, and the world. Until then, this is Sarwar Kashmeri. Goodbye.